With the insane success in Tears of the Kingdom, it's hard not to wonder what the next mainline Zelda game will be. And since the game only released earlier this year, we still don't have a whole lot of knowledge when it comes to the future of the franchise. Luckily, we do have a couple of interviews and other things to talk about when it comes to the future of Zelda. I also think it's worth discussing in this video what the next Zelda game should be, regardless of what we already know. Anyways, since we're going to talk about the future of Zelda, it's best to start with information we already have from the creators of the games. Soon after the release of Tears of the Kingdom, Eiji Aonuma did an interview with Game Informer and talked a little bit about the future Zelda games. The first important thing he says is that the format for Breath of the Wild is going to be a format the Zelda series proceeds from, in a similar way to how Ocarina of Time created a new format for the previous Zelda games to proceed from. This probably means that future Zelda games are going to follow that completely open world exploration style that began in Breath of the Wild. It's also highly possible that certain mechanics, like sprinting and climbing walls wherever, will be in future Zelda games, since he specifically mentioned the open play and freedom within Breath of the Wild. I also wouldn't be surprised if they kept the art style the same as well, or at least kept it similar. If this really is a new format for Zelda, in the same way Ocarina of Time was, I'm expecting the same focus on exploration instead of puzzles that Breath of the Wild had. A lot of you might disagree, but I'm not a huge fan of the puzzles in the old Zelda games. I don't hate them, but I really don't mind that they're gone. The exploration was always the most fun I had with these older Zelda games. Speaking of puzzles, later in the interview it stated that this new style of puzzle solving is also here to stay. Eiji Aonuma says that the rigid puzzle solving in older Zelda games is a past way of developing games. This might mean that the old temples and puzzles in Zelda games aren't ever coming back. Not in the mainline Zelda games at least. The thought process behind this seems to be, cheating is fun, they like it, which is completely understandable. Everyone knows that cheating in every scenario is completely acceptable. Jokes aside, this way of designing a game is exactly why I love Tears of the Kingdom so much. It's not about creating a game where the player does exactly as intended, it's about creating a game that people will enjoy. Being able to cheat might allow players to cheese a puzzle, but as long as the players enjoy cheesing that puzzle, that's all that matters. Let's just say, people who want a rigid and thought-provoking puzzle probably aren't going to enjoy the future Zelda games. So that's what we have from the interview. Seems like the rigid exploration and puzzle solving from the old games is completely abandoned now. This is reiterated, since in a completely different interview for Tears of the Kingdom, Eiji Aonuma says that they aren't concerned with the old Zelda games anymore, and would prefer to focus on the future. These interviews are both really interesting to read through, and I suggest reading both of them yourself, even though they aren't entirely focused on the future of Zelda. Now that the interviews are out of the way, it's time to talk about the things we don't know for sure. I think an important question to ask is if the next Zelda game is going to be a direct sequel to Tears of the Kingdom. We know that the gameplay elements and game design are going to stay similar, but it's never explicitly said if the next Zelda game is going to be another sequel or not. Although it's impossible to say for sure, I think it's safe to say the next Zelda game won't be a sequel to Tears of the Kingdom. They tried their luck with Tears of the Kingdom already, since a lot of people thought it wouldn't live up to Breath of the Wild, myself included. And to be honest, it would become boring to explore the same old Hyrule that we see in both of these games. If they do decide to do a sequel to Tears of the Kingdom, I hope it's about Link exploring some faraway land outside of Hyrule, similar to how Majora's Mask follows Link exploring Termina after the events of Ocarina of Time. It also doesn't seem like a thematically good idea to do a sequel to Tears of the Kingdom. With Ganondorf as the villain, and the final battle being this climactic battle between two immortal dragons, I don't see how Nintendo would be able to make something that beats it. It feels like the biggest battle that this Link has to endure, and it would be pretty crazy if they made something more impactful. This is a good ending to Link and Zelda's story in this universe, and it should be left that way. I think it would make a lot more sense to do a sequel to the most popular Zelda game of all time, Link's crossbow training. Although we also don't know when the next Zelda game is going to come out, we can still assume it won't be for another 2 years, at the very least. Nintendo is probably going to spend the next year or two pumping out some DLC for Tears of the Kingdom to keep the fans satisfied. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was more DLC than Breath of the Wild. There's potential for DLC like a map expansion, which would certainly take up a lot more time than the DLC in Breath of the Wild. It's also important to remember that the gap between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is over 6 years, and Zelda games typically take longer to come out compared to other franchises. They might also release a smaller game or two to keep fans occupied, similar to Age of Calamity. It's hard to say if the next game will take around the same time as Tears of the Kingdom, since there are a lot of things to consider. Tears of the Kingdom had the benefit of a pre-made overworld and pre-existing mechanics, but it also had the downside of needing to change a lot of stuff in order to make the game feel fresh. If I had to take a shot in the dark, I would probably guess that the next big Zelda game will come out in 3 to 5 years. But again, we have pretty much no information. It's been over a year since I've worked on a Zelda game, and the team refused to give me any info. Those ungrateful bastards. In terms of what a brand new Zelda game would exactly be like, it's impossible to tell. So instead, let's discuss a few things that would be nice to have in a future Zelda game. As mentioned before, hopefully the next game isn't a sequel to Tears of the Kingdom. I wouldn't be mad about it, but I would be a lot less excited compared to if there was a brand new game. Another great addition would be a more unique world. Hyrule in the recent games was cool, but it would be nice to play a new Zelda game with more personality, like Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask. Nintendo seems way less willing to take chances and do sillier creative things in these new games, or at least it feels that way. For example, there's this side quest in Majora's Mask where you have to protect cows from alien-like creatures who come every year to steal the cows. You might have assumed this was one of my uncommon jokes, but this actually is a real side quest in Majora's Mask. Something as crazy as this feels like it would be completely out of place in the new Zelda games, but it wasn't crazy before, since something wacky and creative wasn't out of the picture in the old Zelda games. I'm not saying that this new world design is bad, it certainly has its place and makes for a great world, but it would be nice to see a new fairy tale-like world in Zelda. We know they plan to continue the trend of open world exploration, and a more fantasy world would fit perfectly into that style of exploring. Imagination truly is an amazing thing. I mean, just look how many people think Santa Claus is real, or how many people think Australia is real. Speaking of the world, something that would also be nice is a smaller world, or a smaller game in general. It's certainly nice that there's so much content in the new Zelda games, but sometimes I want to sit down and play a smaller game with less to accomplish. Sometimes it feels like there's too much content in certain aspects of Tears of the Kingdom, like Koroks. Do they really need 1,000 Koroks? Or 130 side quests? A large and high-stakes world definitely fits Tears of the Kingdom, but I don't want a game that's the same as Tears of the Kingdom. I want a new and fun adventure. If I were to summarize all of my biggest hopes for a future Zelda game, it would be nothing more than a unique world, not something based off the old games or the new games. It would be nice to see the new game borrow ideas from both of them, instead of completely stray away like the recent games have. But to be honest, I have absolutely no hope in the Zelda team after Tears of the Kingdom. I think the only thing that would make up for it would be a sequel to Link's crossbow training.